Welcome back to RPG Maniacs, where we like our RPGs the way we like our peanut butter. I am your host, Toya, and today we are going to talk about one of my favorite RPG subgenres, the action RPG, and the developer that got action RPGs started to begin with, Nihon Falcom. If you've never heard of Nihon Falcom, I don't blame you. They are one of the oldest game development studios still in existence in Japan, being founded over 37 years ago now, but they are also one of the only Japanese developers to focus, instead of on video game consoles, on personal computers, right from the day of their founding. And due to many differences between Japanese hardware and overseas hardware through the 1980s and 90s, many of Falcom's games were dependent on ports to be brought overseas. Falcom, being PC-focused, is not a company that prioritizes ports in general. Many of its earlier ports were carried out by Hudson Soft or Konami, and for this reason, it took until the PlayStation Portable and Steam era for Falcom to really see exposure in the West. Now, if you are an older gamer of a certain age or just a retro enthusiast interested in old Nintendo Entertainment System titles, there's a good chance that you have actually already played some of Falcom's games without knowing it. I'm thinking of Legacy of the Wizard and Xanadu, two of the most difficult action RPGs on the Nintendo Entertainment System. These were the games that really kept the Nintendo game counselors in business through the 80s. These were the games that were called in more than any other for strategy tips. And if you've never played Xanadu or Legacy of the Wizard, think like Zelda 2, but great. These games are to Zelda 2 what Super Mario Bros. 3 is to platformers as a whole. Now, even if you do know these games front to back, what you probably don't know is that they spawned from one of the most influential RPG franchises in Japan, Dragon Slayer. Predating Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and just about any other RPG you can name, Dragon Slayer was a 1984 PC 88 game and one of Falcom's earliest titles, which, alongside Hydlide and Courageous Perseus, would help codify what the action RPG would be. All of these games were inspired by the arcade title, The Tower of Druaga, which out of all of them, ironically, Druaga has probably aged the best, because it was an arcade game with much more powerful hardware behind it, but that doesn't mean you should play it. While groundbreaking in their own time period, none of these action RPGs really hold up to modern standards of playability. Hydlide is the Zelda you make when Zelda hasn't been invented yet, and regardless of whether or not Miyamoto will ever admit it, there are some very clear paths of inspiration leading from Dragon Slayer 1 to The Legend of Zelda. Legacy of the Wizard's original Japanese title is actually Dragon Slayer 4 Draslay Family, because family of Dragon Slayer, so Draslay, yeah, you get it. Xanadu is actually an abbreviation for Famicom Xanadu, as in a Xanadu for the Japanese Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, while Legacy of the Wizard was created by Falcom, Xanadu was actually created by Hudson Soft as part of a licensing deal with them. See, in the early 80s, Xanadu was wildly popular, and was probably the best-selling piece of PC game software in Japan up to that point, selling around 400,000 copies, during a time frame when computers were not an everyday device, and the internet was still a good 11 to 12 years off. Out of all of the early action RPGs, Xanadu stands out because it's the first game that I would tentatively label as good. Not in the sense that you should go out and play it, but in the sense that this is the first action RPG where you can jump in and start playing and have fun. Like, the game is still kind of fun, all these years later. It captured something essential to the action RPG genre, and that was quickly picked up and emulated by other games made by developers who played Xanadu and said, "This is really good, let's do better." There's really only a framework of a plot to this game, one outlined more in promotional copy than in the game itself. There's a town, there's a dungeon beneath it, you build your character and descend into the dungeon and explore all of its levels, in search of treasure, monsters to fight, magic to learn, and ultimately enemies to defeat. I was first introduced to this game through its Sega Saturn remake on the Falcom Classics collection, and it's prettier, but the core gameplay hasn't changed that much. I was shocked at the fact that I could still enjoy it all these years later. I mean, this is a game that the actual design of it and the layout of the levels, all of it predates the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is where gaming traditionally begins. If you look at people's chronologies of video games, they tend to ignore things before the Famicom, unless of course they're old Space Invaders fans like my dad, and they can't get over how great Space Invaders was and is, and they buy every new re-released version. Dad, are you listening to me? Now, I haven't finished Xanadu. Most people that play Xanadu will never finish it. In fact, I would not be surprised to learn that the number of people in human history who have finished Xanadu is still only in the triple digits. There might be 100, 150, maybe even 200 people worldwide that have finished this game. But Xanadu is not really about finishing it. And this is something that I learned through looking at Japanese reactions to the game and discussions of it. This is about the experience and what that experience can do for you. Because Xanadu is a game where, on the one hand, you are building up your skill in combat, your ability to work with the bump combat system that would later inspire the Ease series, and on the other, you are building up your character and your raw stats. And this isn't the first game to do it, but it is one of the earliest games to master the idea of a feedback loop. Going through, defeating enemies, gathering their loot, gathering their gold, purchasing weapons. Only the real loop in this game is the understanding it brings to you, because this is actually a limited resources game. It is very carefully designed so that you can fail and start over. Every single enemy in this game is a precious resource, because once you kill them, they will never come back. There is exactly one of that particular enemy. It doesn't respawn, it can never be revived. And this is important because in Xanadu, it is your weapons that are gaining the experience points. And this impacts your title, which affects your ability to access the lower levels of the dungeon. You have to have a sufficiently high title before you can go through certain doors. But it matters because if you just go through the game blindly killing all of the enemies, then you won't be able to power up your late game weapons and deal with the bosses necessary to overcome Xanadu. And you have all of these other limited resources, like the lamps necessary to light up dark dungeons so that you can see and navigate, or the potions that reduce karma acquired from killing good aligned enemies. If you simply try to exploit the game without any thought to how it is structured, you will fail and be forced into a situation that is deliberately unwinnable, in which you must restart because you can no longer progress. It's a game that encourages a particular mentality of, I'm not just gonna lose all my progress, I'm gaining experience, real personal understanding of the game that I am going to take with me into subsequent playthroughs. I'm going to take notes, I am going to comprehend how to proceed, and eventually, someday, I'll get down that perfect playthrough that brings me to the end of Xanadu. And then you can start up the DLC, which it's 1985 or whatever, so the DLC is actually extra floppy disks you have to buy and plug in after you've inserted the original disks. Also, the ending is just a big long Bible quote that Falcom probably didn't understand, because yeah, they could read English, but not that well. Now, being a PC game, Xanadu was ported to multiple different platforms, and much of it was actually in English to begin with. I think that all of the text in at least the MSX version is natively in English, so you don't need any Japanese understanding to play. And I'm not sure if I would recommend playing Xanadu, but it is interesting to look back and see that there were clearly elements like the throwable magic that would have inspired items and spells in other games like Zelda, and further down the line, the Mana series. Xanadu's non-linear open-world underground with its many sprawling dungeons is staggering to behold, even today. It's difficult to put to words how big the game is, spanning 11 levels each with up to 4 dungeons and a combined 12 boss battles. Even with assistance, it feels impossible to get through, and that's probably why most of the playthroughs you see online end unfinished. Xanadu actually played a role in the rise of Japanese computer magazines like Comtique and Login, which became popular in part because they featured strategies for beating the game. But knowing a strategy and executing it are two different things, and Xanadu is exemplary of this. Even when you know what to do, the action elements ensure that you can't always execute that strategy with perfect precision, and human error becomes a key factor in how you experience the game and adapt to it. While Zelda 1 was primarily influenced by Dragon Slayer, Xanadu's popularity likely played a role in the development of both Zelda 2 and Metroid. Xanadu's overall approach to level structure and having a continuously interconnected world made it the archetypal codifier of what we today call the Metroidvania subgenre. All that said, it's a very clunky game as far as action RPGs go, relying heavily on keyboard commands to navigate and a combat system that's still very rough around the edges. It's not always clear when or why certain attacks will go through, which is a terrible weakness to have as an action RPG. The battle mechanics simply aren't very transparent, and even once you know what everything does, sometimes your attacks will just fail, and you won't be entirely certain what you did wrong. Even so, Xanadu has quickly become my favorite game that I have no hope of finishing. It's just incredibly deep for 1984, and it's hard to say when exactly the scale of its world was even surpassed. This has been Toya. Thank you for joining me today. If you liked what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. You can find me on Twitter at VanguardUs, on Twitch at DecodeToya, and of course, right here at RPG Maniacs.